And so now I would like to introduce the speaker, Ian Cooke. Ian is the long-term director of NepRWA and will be speaking about climate change in Neponset. So without further ado, let's start our program. Okay, Ian, take it away.
Thank you, Dee, and thank you everyone for joining us. It's wonderful to see so many people interested in taking a few minutes to talk about a very important topic. So give me one moment to get my slides going here. And there we go. So it's always good to start with the big picture, and when you're talking about climate change, it's a very big picture. So I think I'm assuming everybody on this call has heard about the whole idea of climate change sometime over the last 30 years. You know, it's an issue that has been out there for a long time. Scientists have been talking about for a long time. You know, but to a significant degree, society has not responded to as much as one might think they would, given how serious an issue it is. And I think something, in my perception anyway, has kind of changed around the climate change issue in the last couple of years as we keep having more and more events that seem clearly climate related and that are more tangible to people, things people can really see and feel themselves. And as that's been happening, there's been kind of a change in perspective around climate issues, where we've gone from thinking about the truly global to trying to understand what's going to happen actually in our communities and what kinds of things we need to be doing to prepare for that. And just to set the context here, our organization is the Neponset River Watershed Association. We work to clean up and protect the Neponset River and its watershed, which includes parts of 14 cities and towns around the river, starting in Foxborough next to Gillette Stadium and ending down in the city of Austin in Dorchester, Mattapan, and Hyde Park. And there's about 330,000 people that live in the watershed, about 120,000 people that get their drinking water from sources in the watershed. And, you know, the river has had a long history of slow, steady progress in terms of environmental improvement and cleanup. Over the last couple of years, increasingly, there is a better and better understanding at a localized level what we can expect to happen with climate change, and also a lot more progress in the thinking about what all levels of government and the private sector need to be doing to get ready for it. So I always like to start with a graph, give people a little flashback to their math class. And this is an example of one of those so-called downscaled climate projections. You know, so we're not talking about, you know, 2 degrees Celsius average across the globe here. This is actually an estimate for the town of Canton of how many days a year we have and are going to be having with temperatures above 90 degrees. And you can see on the left side of the graph, the little gray bars are the actual number of days since 1950 to the present. And then as you move to the right side of the graph, you start to see the projection. You know, and historically we were having, you know, something on the order of 5, 6, 7, 10 days a year over 90 degrees. And on the right, you've got kind of a band of red and a red line and a band of blue and a blue line. And those really represent the potential trajectories of future air temperatures, days above 90 degrees, in a sort of business as usual emissions scenario and in a pretty modest emissions reduction scenario where we kind of get emissions under control by the middle of the century and start reducing them thereafter. And the dark lines are sort of the median outcome they're expecting, and the sort of light, either pink or blue area around the line is showing you kind of the range of possible outcomes. So it's a pretty drastic change, particularly if you start looking at the red line. You know, I'm not personally very enthused about the prospects of living in the Neponset watershed with 70 days a year, or maybe 115 days a year above 90 degrees. You know, that would be a very fundamental change that would affect all kinds of things. And you know, the implications of this are very widespread. And part of why I like this graph is it does, you know, you can see the divergence between the red line and the blue line. And that's really a choice we face as a society right now. You know, are we going to muster the political will to change the trajectory of our emissions, both in the US and around the world? You know, I think we have the capability to do that. It doesn't depend on magical technology that's as yet undiscovered, but it's really a question about what we're willing to do to help ourselves and to help our children. I think the other thing that really strikes me about this graph is, you know, I reached a birthday milestone myself not too long ago. You know, and I think that on that basis, I can conclude I'm not going to be here by the time we get to the end of this graph. But I have a 17-year-old daughter. And when I look at this graph, I think, you know, this represents conditions during much of her life. And she might almost make it to the end of the graph if she's lucky. So this notion that climate change is sort of an abstract and far off problem is really something that's starting to change. So in terms of general implications of climate change, one of the biggest ones is public health. You know, the kind of heat and weather changes we're talking about are going to create real challenges for public health, particularly for vulnerable populations like minority, low-income populations, elderly populations. And it raises all kinds of equity issues that really need to be central as we think about how communities move forward to try to deal with these issues. There's going to be tremendous ecological effects. This is one of our native brook trout from Pine Tree Brook, very sensitive to temperature, and certainly the flora and the fauna in the Neponset watershed are going to undergo dramatic transformations. And then the last piece is just sort of society and our economy. You know, if we don't deal with these issues, both by trying to reduce emissions and by trying to prepare our communities for some of these impacts, we're going to face tremendous economic disruption and economic challenges. So it's really in our own best interest, even our own best financial interest, to get moving on these issues now. So when we think about this in terms of water, which is what we really deal with, you know, a lot of the challenges we're going to see play out in terms of water. And the first, and perhaps at this point seemingly best understood of those, is sea level rise. You know, these kind of downscaled projections are seem to be better developed for certain kinds of indicators than for others. They seem to be pretty well developed for temperature, and they're pretty well developed for climate change. So we've had, for sea level rise. So we've had very roughly a foot of sea level rise over the last century or so. And the sort of optimistic projection is that maybe we'll get another 2.5 feet or so. But then again, you see in the high emission scenario, we're talking about you know, something like another 4.5 feet. And even, you know, at the outside, notions of 10 feet. And for anybody who's been reading the latest media coverage of the new studies coming out of Antarctica, that notion of the dotted line at the very top seems a little more concerning than one might otherwise think. We've already seen some of these issues start to play out in the Neponset. These are photographs from the winter storm we had in 2018. Along the Neponset, this is Milton Landing and the Milton Yacht Club in the background. That fence you see in the front is about 4 feet high, and there's actually a parking lot behind it. And this is, you know, not too different than some of the water levels we're going to be seeing around the estuary on a very frequent basis if you go out 50 years. Just another example, here was the same event behind the Adams Inn. This is not quite at the peak of the storm, but certainly lots of impact on all the cars and the inn itself from that one event. Understanding how this is going to, how sea level is going to change and what that really means for individual communities is a process that's really just starting. The city of Boston, I think, is really far out ahead of most everybody else in terms of thinking about this. This map was put together by the Mass Department of Transportation, who's obviously interested in the health of the Southeast Expressway, which you can see sort of here coming up through the middle of the map. And what this map is actually showing you is how it's not so much you know, the 100-year storm. It's showing how frequently different areas in the Neponset estuary expect to be inundated. You know, and one of the things that I think is really interesting about this is, you know, we already sort of live with and think about the 100-year storm, and, you know, oh, am I going to get flooded once every 100 years? And maybe I can live with that. But if you look at this map, some of the areas in the estuary, certainly all of the salt marshes, are going to be fully inundated every year. But there are many developed areas in the estuary that are going to be inundated, you know, every year or every other year, such as, you know, this area down here is State Street South in Quincy. This building is actually the Blue Cross Blue Shield building. And maybe that building itself is not getting flooded so often, but the parking lots and roadways that feed into it are facing enormous challenges. There is actually a building right there. There's another recently completed building right here. You know, and many of these features that are really at risk now are things that were in many cases built in places they probably shouldn't have been built in the first place, you know, built in salt marshes or other low-lying areas. And I think cities and towns are going to have to really start investing some thought in how to deal with these vulnerable areas, and whether they all should be defended. You know, that's one of the interesting questions here. Is you know, certainly there are places where you can make relatively modest modifications and protect developed areas. But there's also places where there's trade-offs to be made between environmental resources and spending lots and lots of money to defend developed areas. And I think that's something cities and towns are going to have to start wrestling with increasingly as time goes on. The other category that we think about in terms of water is extreme precipitation. And there's lots of evidence that shows that the big rain events that we're accustomed to experiencing have really changed. This is over the last century across the country. How much change there's been in our largest rain events in the Northeast is certainly far and away the most dramatic change across the country, and a very dramatic increase. You know, the notion of what constitutes a 100-year storm event in the Neponset watershed has gone from, you know, about 6.5 inches. If you look at the 1960s data, which is actually what the state still requires developers to look at when they're designing new development, to about 8.5+ inches now. And the expectation is that it's headed to something on the order of 11.5 inches by the middle of the century. So big changes. We had a very dramatic demonstration of what some of those changes might look like in Norwood Center earlier this summer. There was over a very small geographic area, there was a very short, very intense downpour with 3 or more inches of rain falling in a highly developed area in the course of about an hour. And the consequence of that was really the storm drain system, the engineered storm drain system that's designed to capture water and carry it away from developed areas, was never designed to handle anything like that. And consequently, it failed with dramatic results here at the back of the Norwood Hospital. And this picture I thought was just incredible. This is the back door of the Norwood Hospital finally giving way against 5 feet of standing floodwater, trying to get into the back door. And that's not something anybody wants to see in their building. And of course, the hospital remains closed and will probably be closed for a long time because of this very short event. And I think that the real challenge here, so certainly it was an extreme rain event, but that's the kind of sort of small, very intense rainstorm we're going to be seeing much more of going forward. And we've sort of built our communities with, pavement, building surfaces, hard surfaces that force all the water to run off very quickly to try to get to, the nearest waterway that remains. This is actually the Neponset River through Hyde Park, and you can sort of see all of those hard surfaces. And when 3 inches of rain falls on those hard surfaces, it's got to get into one of these somewhere and into a pipe, and that pipe has to lead to the river. And that infrastructure is simply not designed for anything like the kinds of rainfall that is going to be happening with increasing frequency in the future. And rebuilding that infrastructure is a key task for our cities and towns. One of the key things that needs to happen as part of reimagining our drainage infrastructure is trying to build in features to capture and slow down that runoff before it gets to waterways. The key here is slowing it down. This is an example of a large rain garden or bioretention cell that was built at the Gibbon School a couple of years ago in partnership with the town of Stoughton. And a good example of the kinds of practices we need to be investing in and thinking about more going forward. We also, it's not just the public infrastructure that needs to be upgraded. Most of the pavement in our watersheds is privately owned. And currently, we frankly don't hold that private pavement to a very high standard. Currently state standards, and the state does intend to change this, but state standards direct developers to use outdated 1960s vintage rainfall data when they're designing their stormwater systems. And for areas that have historically been paved, our state guidelines currently only ask that developers not make it worse. And really, we need to think about how every piece of private development and redevelopment can actually be making our situation better rather than simply not worse. Once the water gets off the pavement, it needs to go somewhere. And the question is, where is it going to go? In an ideal world, it goes someplace like this. This is Foul Meadow, a huge floodplain in the central part of the watershed, which provides, aside from providing a great wildlife habitat, provides place for the water to kind of spread out and slow down, soak into the ground, and sort of keep out of harm's way. And the city of Boston is very much protected by the existence of Foul Meadow. The storm event that was so destructive in Norwood Center really was almost not noticeable in Boston because so much of that water sort of sat here in the Foul Meadow floodplain until things had calmed down. But under current rules, we're really not adequately protecting our floodplains. So currently, our rules say you have to protect the 100-year floodplain based on the 1960s version of what counts as a 100-year storm, which is the pink area shown in this map. Really, we know that what we used to think of as the 500-year flood is now the 100-year flood. And so we really need to be protecting both the pink and the orange sections of this map if we want to be doing a meaningful job of protecting our floodplains. So that's another policy change we really need to make.
Ian,
And then
Ian, I'm going to give you a 5-minute reminder here. Thank
okay,
you.
thank you. And then the other thing is, over the years, we have built lots of stuff in our floodplains. And those, again, just like in the coastal areas, those installations, that I don't mean to pick on the Norwood Airport here, they're certainly not the only thing that has been built in the Neponset River floodplain over the years. But there's a big question of how much do we want to try to build infrastructure to defend these installations that are in very vulnerable areas, and are there opportunities to actually restore the floodplain, and increase its function to protect other areas. Another big challenge across the Neponset watershed and the state is dams. Many people have a misconception that dams reduce floods, and it's true. There are some dams that are designed to do that and capable of doing that. But of the 100 dams in the Neponset, only 2 are actually designed as flood control dams, and the much more typical reaction of dams to major flood events in our area is to fall down and make the flood much worse. So looking at opportunities to remove obsolete dams and to make sure that those that really have a reason to stay are up to snuff and have enhanced ability to withstand large storms. Similarly, road crossing culverts. Every place a road crosses a stream in the Neponset watershed, there's a pipe that or a conduit that carries that stream underneath the road. Many of those, and there's hundreds of them around the watershed, are not large enough to convey the kinds of storm flows that we already have, let alone what's happening in the future. So another big piece of public infrastructure that needs a lot of attention and investment. The flip side of those high flows is that we're ironically not only going to get more water, we're also going to get less water. And this is just a graph of stream flow on the Neponset, looking at the low flows each year. And you can see that, in fact, the flows on the low flows on the Neponset are trending down over a long-term period, which makes sense. So when you combine more drought in the future with continued water withdrawals, a loss of groundwater recharge, and the way we manage wastewater in a very centralized fashion, you can find yourself with streams that are really challenged. Obviously, this is on Millbrook in Medfield a few years ago. And obviously, this is not a great condition for stream habitat. Another consequence of climate change, both in terms of lower flows and higher temperatures, is going to be more and more challenges with water quality. We've made enormous progress with improving water quality, but low flows and high temperatures tend to aggravate things like algae blooms, make waterways more sensitive to nutrient pollution. So another big challenge. And then the solutions to this on the drought side they're complicated. Part of it is simply we need to use water more efficiently. In the future, we simply may not be able to, water our lawns in the middle of the day all summer long through a drought. We can also think strategically about how we're using water on a seasonal basis. Massachusetts is very lucky that it has, in the central part of the state, a very large reservoir controlled by the Mass Water Resources Authority, but presently, and which could provide some relief for local rivers and streams that are being subjected to high water withdrawals from local wells. But in most cases, we're not choosing to use that water to provide some relief for the health of streams. So anyway, and this is my last slide. So this is a complicated topic to dive into in 20 minutes, but we have a lot of challenges to meet. I think the good news in all this is that if we make the changes and investments that we need to both reduce emissions and adapt to that climate change, which we can't avoid, there are going to be incredible additional benefits that come with that in terms of cleaner air, better public health, cleaner water, healthier communities. So it's, we certainly face a challenge in the years ahead. I think these are issues that both the federal government, cities and towns need to wrestle with much more deeply. But I think there's a lot to be gained through that effort. So with that, I will conclude because I suspect he's about to give me the high sign. And if folks have questions, I'm happy to answer a few questions.
Anyway, thank you so much, Ian, for that thought-provoking talk. I know it's a whole lot more than 20 minutes can hold, but perhaps you might want to answer some questions. And we have one from our chat, which is, what is NepRWA doing to make communities more resilient to climate change?
Do we have another 20 minutes?
No.
Most of the issues I highlighted there are things that that we're working on. So a big focus for us has been working with communities to help them improve their stormwater infrastructure and frankly, to build public support for the investments that communities need to make there. I think water conservation is a big focus for us. You know, dealing with dams and culverts has become a big focus for us. We sort of initially came to that from a wildlife habitat standpoint, looking at fish migration and fish connectivity and bringing the historic herring and shad runs back up the Neponset River. But it's very much a climate adaptation, safety, transportation issue as well. So maybe leave it at that, but we could have a long conversation about what we're trying to do to tackle these issues.
Okay, well, maybe you could take some questions from the people that are still here. If we have maybe another 5 or 7 or 10 minutes. Anyone here want to ask some questions of Ian? Can they unmute? Can they hear me? Yes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, and anyone on here would like to ask any questions of Ian while we're still here? It's 1 o'clock. And if not, we'll end our presentation, but we'd love to have some more questions if possible.
I have a question.
Okay, hi, Ellen.
This is probably a really naive question, but given that our rainfall has increased, and in the spring it's really, really soggy around here, and yet now we're in a drought condition, is that drought, I mean, I realize that we need more rain, but is part of the drought condition the fact that we have such a large population that we're drawing out of this water, as opposed to, you know what I'm trying to say? I mean, how much of the population using the water? Because it's like, okay, we have lots of rain here. We have an increased amount of rain. Why are we in the situation that we're in?
So I think it operates on a couple levels. So certainly one answer is, one of the things we expect with climate change is we're going to get more rain on an annual basis, particularly in the winter. More of it is going to be received in very large rainfall events, which kind of flush through the system very quickly. But combined with that, we ironically are going to get more frequent drought in the summer. So periods when we don't have rain. And really one of the things you have to remember about climate and its effect on the weather is it's really driving the extremes. So you're sort of getting more of all the extremes. It's really kind of a devious situation. There is also a long-term underlying challenge in the Neponset watershed in terms of the way we use water. You know, we do withdraw a lot of water in the summer when the river is normally lower, even when it's not during a drought. And then most of that water in most of our communities gets shipped out to a sewer treatment plant and never comes back to the Neponset watershed. We have no sewer treatment plants returning water to the Neponset. So you've sort of got both this long-standing challenge of sort of every year, really whether it's dry or not, we're doing things that are artificially lowering the amount of water in the river in the summer. And then you sort of put an extra layer of drought on top of that. And it just makes this situation even more challenging. I don't know if that helps explain the situation.
Thank you.
I have a quick question, Ian.
Sure.
Thanks a lot. Great talk. I just want to know, like, when we talk about the issues in Neponset watershed area, as you mentioned, like, for example, replacing the infrastructure and other projects, that might need a lot of fundings, right? So my question is related to, like, how local governments or like state government is supporting as your watershed. Uh, First question. And the second part of it is, how you like bringing all communities within your watershed area into those projects, planning, execution, like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Gufran. And actually, I should have acknowledged Crew as a co-sponsor of this event too, helping to get the word out. So thank you for the good work that you do. So I think, you know, it's sort of the early days in terms of meaningful funding for this sort of work. Unfortunately, there really is not strong. So municipalities certainly have some of their own revenue sources. You know, they have, you know, their local tax revenues, but most municipalities are stretched pretty thin in that regard. Some municipalities, and we're encouraging more of them to think about this, are establishing what we call a stormwater utility. It's essentially a fee-based approach to paying for stormwater infrastructure that's more similar to the way you would collect fee-based revenue for drinking water or for wastewater. Stormwater has sort of always been the poor stepchild of the three major chunks of water infrastructure. And then the other question is, what's the role of the state and particularly the feds in trying to help fund some of this work? And the state has actually been quite proactive in this regard. They've created a great planning program called the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program that challenges communities to prepare a fairly straightforward plan for climate adaptation. The plans don't tend to be terribly elaborate or sophisticated at this point, but at least it's starting a conversation at the municipal level. And I'm pleased to say that we now have, I think, the last of our communities that we're trying to egg on to do that planning process is getting started this year. Everybody else is finished. And then once you have that plan in place, you're eligible to apply for grants. And in fact, the governor just announced, I believe it was $11 million worth of MVP grants yesterday, which is wonderful. It's actually a fairly sizable investment from the state. But when you compare that investment to the scale of the problem, you know, it's still just a drop in the bucket. And I think both the state and the feds need to be thinking harder about this. And I think one of the big areas we need to look at seriously is, what are we asking the private sector to do when the private sector develops land? So I think we need all those pieces to be working together. Does anybody else have a question they want to toss out?
Can we take one more question? And anybody? No? Okay, well, if not, I think we will end our presentation here. I want to thank Ian very much for doing the presentation. I want to thank everybody who has attended for being here, and hopefully you will join us at some of our next presentations. The next one is in October. And I think this will be it. This is ending our slideshow right now. And here are some upcoming events, our Watershed Wednesdays. And I would also like to thank one more person, or actually it's a business, and it's our sponsor, Clay Subaru of Norwood. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us.